The early morning mist hung thick in the air, and the cold bit at Luke's skin as he trudged through the snow-covered forest. A faint cry echoed from the trees, sharp and desperate, drawing him closer. It was a sound he couldn't ignore, one that would change everything. As Luke approached, the source of the cry became clear: a dog, trembling and chained to a tree, its eyes locked with his. A flicker of hope in its gaze. Luke's heart pounded. Torn between fear and determination, he reached out slowly. But he knew one thing: he couldn't walk away. Please leave a comment telling us where you're watching from, and don't forget to hit the like button to support this story. Luke Dawson, once a proud Marine, had returned to his small hometown after being medically discharged from the military. His body was scarred by years of service, chronic back pain, damaged joints, and the lingering effects of PTSD. The horrors of war followed him everywhere, even in his quiet hometown where life seemed unchanged. At 32, Luke's face, once youthful, now carried the weight of the battles he had fought, both on the field and within his own mind. His eyes, still sharp, had become windows to a soul heavy with memories of war, memories he couldn't erase and couldn't fully understand. He had hoped that returning home would bring peace, but it was a false hope. The small town, once his sanctuary, now fell to still, to quiet. The people he once knew had moved on with their lives, but Luke remained stuck in his past, haunted by the trauma he couldn't shake. Through it all, there was one constant: Bolt. Bolt wasn't just a dog. He was Luke's companion, his protector, and his friend. The Belgian Malinois had been more than a military working dog. On the battlefield, they were a team, relying on each other in life or death situations. Luke could still remember the sound of Bolt's paws pounding against the dirt as they charged forward together, the dog's sharp senses often keeping them alive when human instincts failed. Bolt saved Luke's life more than once, pulling him from danger, guiding him through thick smoke, and standing guard in the darkest hours. Luke had always believed that when his service was over, Bolt would be retired with him, his loyal companion for the rest of his days. But that didn't happen. The government had promised to find a home for all military dogs upon retirement. But as Luke soon discovered, those promises were nothing more than empty words. Instead of retiring with dignity, Bolt was left behind, tossed aside like just another piece of military equipment. The thought of Bolt being forgotten broke something deep inside Luke, and with it came a fierce determination. He wouldn't allow his friend, his hero, to be left behind in the same way he had been. It was time to act. Luke's hometown, nestled in the rolling hills of the Midwest, seemed to have frozen in time. The same small-town charm that once offered him peace now felt like a cage. The familiar streets and faces were comforting, yet stifling. He found it difficult to adjust to a life outside of the military. The constant hum of adrenaline, the camaraderie of fellow soldiers, these things had become a part of him, and without them, he was left with a void he couldn't fill. The silence at home was deafening. His small, modest house felt cold despite the warmth of the fireplace crackling in the living room, the remnants of a life that had been interrupted too many times by deployments sat round him, unpacked boxes, an old army jacket hanging on a chair, and a pile of letters from friends and comrades, most unopened. He hadn't yet had the courage to face them, to relive the days when everything was simpler, when he could count on the companionship of his unit, of Bolt. Bolt had always been his anchor. The Belgian Malinois wasn't just a dog. He was Luke's anchor to the world, his link to the man he used to be. The dog had been with him through thick and thin, across deserts, through jungles, and in places where the sound of gunfire was constant. Luke could still picture Bolt's eyes, sharp and watchful, scanning every corner of the battlefield for danger. Their bond wasn't simply one of a soldier and his dog, it was one of survival, trust, and deep, unspoken understanding. Bolt had been there during the darkest moments of Luke's service, always alert, always by his side, saving him more than once. When they were separated during Luke's discharge, he never imagined that Bolt would be left behind, abandoned without the care he deserved. Luke's mornings now started with a cup of black coffee, staring out at the grey sky, wondering if there was still a way to rebuild his life and whether that could include bringing Bolt home. The quiet town didn't seem to care about the dogs that served in war. To them, Bolt was just another retired animal, forgotten in the bureaucracy. But to Luke, Bolt was still the hero who had saved his life, and he wouldn't rest until he found his partner again. One grey morning, just as the first light of day began to break through the mist, Luke found himself staring at the screen of his laptop, searching again for any information on Bolt. He had called every military contact he had, every veteran organization, and even the government offices that managed the care of retired military animals. Every call led to the same vague responses. "We'll look into it," or "let me check with logistics." But after weeks of silence, Luke's patience was running out. Frustration boiled over when he received an anonymous tip from a fellow veteran, a woman named Sarah, who had worked in military animal logistics. She told him something that made his blood run cold. Bolt had not been retired to a loving home, as Luke had assumed instead. He had been sent to a private canine facility for retraining and was now just one of many dogs who are essentially abandoned after their service ended. At first, Luke thought it was a mistake, or worse, a cruel joke. But Sarah was persistent. She sent Luke an address, a location just outside a mid-sized city, a few hours' drive away. The facility, hidden behind an old industrial park, was described as run down and neglected. The dogs there, once proud military animals, were no little more than tools in the hands of private contractors. They were being warehoused, left to fade away or, worse, put down when they no longer served a purpose. Luke's hands trembled as he read the message. The realization that Bolt had been discarded like a piece of equipment hit him harder than anything he'd felt before. All those years of trust, loyalty, and sacrifice. And this was how his partner had been treated. He couldn't accept it. He couldn't believe that the military, the country he had served, would allow something so inhumane to happen. His dog, his family, was suffering, and he was the only one who seemed to care. Without hesitation, Luke grabbed his keys, his jacket, and drove off. He couldn't sit still knowing Bolt was out there, somewhere, suffering. He didn't even know if the tip was accurate, but he had to check. He had to know for sure. The drive was long, and as the familiar landscape of home faded behind him, the weight of the situation settled on Luke's shoulders. He had seen his fair share of horrors in war, but this was different. This wasn't just an innocent life caught in the crossfire of battle. It was a betrayal, and Luke wasn't about to let it stand. The quiet road ahead stretched like an open challenge, daring him to confront the truth, no matter how difficult. When he finally reached the facility, he parked his truck at the end of a gravel road, feeling the weight of each step as he approached the dilapidated gate. His heart pounded in his chest, and his mind raced with questions. What would he find? Was Bolt really here? Was it too late? The air was thick with the scent of decay, both physical and moral. As Luke stepped past the rusted gate and made his way toward the crumbling building, he felt the creeping dread settle in his gut, the kind that told him he was about to face something he wasn't prepared for. He didn't know what he was walking into, but he knew he wasn't leaving without answers. Luke's footsteps echoed through the empty parking lot as he neared the facility's entrance. The place looked as though it had been forgotten by time itself. The cracked asphalt, the weeds growing through the cracks, the faded sign hanging loosely on its hinges, it all screamed neglect. The once pristine image of a state-of-the-art facility for retired military dogs now seemed like a distant memory, lost in the years of disrepair. Luke couldn't help but feel a surge of anger as he surveyed the scene. He walked up to the entrance, where a rusted security guard booth stood, and manned, as if the building had been abandoned for years. But there was a faint sound of movement inside. Dogs, their barks, low and desperate, filled the air, a chorus of anguish that made Luke's stomach tighten. He knew those sounds, he had heard them countless times during their missions together. But these weren't the happy, eager barks of trained war dogs. These were cries of loneliness, fear, and neglect. Luke approached the door and pushed it open, wincing as the hinges groaned in protest inside. The smell hit him first stale, damp and foul. The building was dark, with only a few broken light bulbs flickering above. The air was thick with the stench of urine and decay. As Luke made his way down the hallway, he could hear more dogs, their whimpers growing louder with every step he took. His pulse quickened, the dread in his chest deepening. He reached a large room at the end of the hall. The door was cracked open just slightly, enough to see a few shadows moving inside. Hesitant but determined, Luke pushed the door open further. What he saw made his blood run cold. The room was filled with dogs, some caged, some wandering aimlessly, but all looking miserable. Their eyes were dull, their bodies thin, and their coats matted. Some of them were pacing in circles, others were curled up in corners, too exhausted to move. It was clear that these dogs were not being cared for, they were being warehoused, left to waste away in conditions that could only be described as inhumane. And then, in the farthest corner of the room, Luke spotted him, Bolt. His heart skipped a beat, and for a moment he couldn't breathe. There, lying on a cold concrete floor, was his dog, his loyal companion, once proud and strong, now gaunt and trembling. His coat, once thick and shiny, was ragged and matted. Bolt lifted his head slightly, his eyes locking with Luke's for a brief second. Luke thought he saw a spark of recognition before the dog let out a low, weak whine and collapsed back onto the floor. Luke's hands clenched into fists at his sides. The anger, the betrayal, it all surged through him in a tidal wave. He had come here to find his dog, to bring him home. But instead, he had found a broken shell of the dog he had fought beside. It was as if the war had taken everything from Bolt, and now, this place, this godforsaken facility had finished the job. But Luke wasn't leaving without him. No, this wasn't the end. It couldn't be. He wouldn't let it be. With a grim resolve, he moved forward, kneeling beside Bolt, his hands trembling as he reached out. "I'm here, buddy," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm not leaving you here," as Bolt weakly raised his head and met Luke's gaze again. Luke felt something stir deep inside him, a renewed sense of purpose. He had no idea what it would take, but he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going to let this place win. The fight for Bolt's freedom, for his dignity, was just beginning. If you're enjoying the content, comment your location and click on the subscribe button to stay updated with future episodes. Luke's heart was still pounding as he knelt beside Bolt, stroking his dog's matted fur with trembling hands. It was impossible to ignore the toll that years of neglect had taken on his once vibrant companion. His dog's ribs were visible through his thin coat, and his breathing was shallow, labored from both physical weakness and emotional exhaustion. But even in this state, Luke could feel the bond that had never truly broken, the quiet trust Bolt had always placed in him. As Luke gently lifted Bolt into his arms, he heard voices approaching from behind. He quickly pulled back, instinctively crouching to shield Bolt from view. The voices grew louder as two men in faded uniforms appeared at the door. both looking completely disinterested in their surroundings. They were more focused on their conversation than the room of neglected war dogs they were supposed to be caring for. One of them was holding a clipboard, scribbling something down with no real concern for the animals round him. Another batch coming in next week, one of the men said, glancing at his clipboard. They're supposed to be ready for resale. Right. Yeah. The other man responded lathily. Soldiers are gonna pay top dollar for these guys. If we get enough of them, we can flip them to private contractors in the next month. They'll pay big to train them up again. Luke's blood ran cold. He had suspected something was off. But hearing them talk so casually about the fate of these animals, like they were nothing more than products to be sold, made the anger inside him surge. He knew right then that this wasn't an isolated incident, it was a system of exploitation, a cycle of cruelty and indifference that had been going on for far too long. These dogs weren't just abandoned, they were being used and discarded as if their lives meant nothing. Luke could feel the weight of the injustice, and it filled him with a new kind of rage. He couldn't just walk out of here with Bolt. That would be too easy, too temporary. He needed to expose this place for what it was, expose the people behind it, the corruption, and the system that allowed it all to happen. But he also knew that this wasn't going to be easy. The men talking in the hallway were only the surface of a much deeper problem. He couldn't take Bolt and walk away quietly. Not when this place was part of something much bigger. As he glanced down at his dog, Bolt's eyes met his once again, weak but full of trust. Luke knew that if he was going to give Bolt a second chance, he would have to fight not just for his dog but for every dog that had ever been abandoned by the system. With a grim sense of determination, Luke stood up slowly, cradling Bolt against his chest. His mind raced with plans, but one thing was clear. He wasn't leaving here without a fight. The facility might think it could get away with exploiting these dogs, but Luke wasn't going to let it. He would expose the corruption at any cost. Before he left the room, Luke overheard the men talking again. "Do you think anyone's gonna notice?" one of them asked. "Not unless someone stupid enough to come snooping round," the other replied with a chuckle. That was it. The tipping point. Luke knew he had to act fast, before the entire operation was erased. He was already on borrowed time, and the authorities were either too complacent or too complicit to stop this. He needed proof, something concrete to take down this whole corrupt network. He stepped back toward the door, but his mind was spinning with the magnitude of what he had just overheard. This wasn't just about Bolt. This was about all the dogs that had been treated as disposable. He had no idea how deep this ran, but he knew one thing. He wasn't just going to save Bolt, he was going to bring the truth to light. The battle was just beginning, and Luke Dawson wasn't going down without a fight. Luke moved swiftly toward the door, Bolt carefully nestled against his chest. He could feel the weight of the dog's frail body, the warmth that still lingered despite the suffering, and it stirred something deep within him, a fierce protectiveness, as he crept down the hallway, trying to remain as silent as possible. His mind raced with thoughts of what he had just overheard. The men in the hallway weren't just low-level employees. They were part of something much larger. Luke's gut told him there was an entire system in place to exploit these dogs for a profit, and that system was protected by layers of bureaucracy and corruption. Once outside the building, the cold air hit him hard. Luke pulled his jacket tighter around him, but it wasn't the cold that made him shiver. It was the realization that his mission had just grown exponentially larger. No longer was it just about rescuing Bolt, it was about exposing an entire network of exploitation and abuse that extended far beyond this facility. His thoughts were interrupted by a faint voice from the front gate. Someone had noticed him. Without hesitation, Luke ducked behind a rusted dumpster. keeping Bolt pressed close to his chest. He watched as one of the men from earlier made his way outside. His steps slow and disinterested as he lit a cigarette. Luke felt the pressure building in his chest. He had no plan for this. He hadn't anticipated a confrontation so soon. But he couldn't afford to be caught. Not now. The fight had only just begun. He waited, watching the man's every move. He needed a way out, a way to keep both him and Bolt safe. It was then that he noticed an old, abandoned van parked at the far side of the lot. The door was slightly ajar, and there was no sign of life round it. It was his chance. With cautious movements, Luke made his way toward the van, staying low. He could still hear the man outside talking to himself, unaware of the danger approaching. Luke's heart raced as he reached the van, opened the door, and slipped inside, gently placing Bolt on the floor beside him. It was in the safety of the van that the full weight of what he'd just discovered hit him. His dog wasn't just abandoned, he had been sold into a system that profited from the suffering of military animals, and Bolt was merely one of many. The facility he had just snuck out of was one piece of a much larger, sinister operation, and behind it all were powerful people with connections, influence, and the means to keep the entire situation under wraps. Luke's mind shifted into overdrive. He knew that getting out of here was just the first step. He needed to gather proof, to expose this corrupt system before it could erase all traces of what had happened to these dogs. There was too much at stake now. Too much to lose, and Bolt's life was only the beginning. As he started the van's engine, Luke's resolve grew. He had a new mission, one that went beyond rescuing his dog. It was about justice, not just for Bolt, but for all the animals who had been treated as disposable. He had to make the truth known. He couldn't let the system get away with this. It was going to be a long road ahead, filled with obstacles and dangers. But Luke wasn't about to back down now. With a final glance at the facility in the rearview mirror, Luke set his sights on the future. He wasn't just fighting for a Bolt anymore, he was fighting for all the forgotten heroes. The battle had just begun. The drive back to town was a blur. Luke's mind raced. Consumed by the weight of everything he had just uncovered, he gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white, barely noticing the scenery as it flashed past. Every mile that took him further from the facility felt like one step closer to uncovering the truth, but also one step closer to the dangers he knew were waiting for him. He couldn't shake the images from the facility. The neglected dogs, the cages, the looks of fear and exhaustion in their eyes. It wasn't just Bolt, though seeing his dog in that state had been a gut punch. It was every dog that had been cast aside. The more Luke thought about the things the men had said, the more it sickened him. These animals were being sold off to the highest bidder, their lives and sacrifices reduced to monetary value. They were being treated like tools, no better than discarded machinery when their usefulness had expired. Luke didn't know how deep the corruption ran, but he knew it was vast. He had already seen the first layer of private contractors profiting from the suffering of these animals, but it wasn't enough. He needed proof, something tangible that could expose the people behind this network and bring them to justice. That's why he wasn't heading home yet. His fight wasn't over. It was just beginning. As he pulled into a quiet parking lot near a small cafe, Luke's mind began to formulate a plan. He needed to get in touch with the right people, veterans who could help him take on the system and bring attention to the issue. But he knew he couldn't just walk into an office and file a report. This wasn't going to be solved with paperwork. This was bigger than that. He needed to gather evidence, document everything, and then make the truth known. And for that, he needed a team. It didn't take long for Luke to call in a few favors. A former platoon mate, Mike, picked up on the first ring. Mike was always someone Luke could count on. Even after all these years, they had served together in some of the toughest missions. And Mike had a way of getting things done, even when the odds were stacked against them. "Luke, what's going on?" Mike asked, his voice steady but with an edge of concern. "You sound like something's wrong." Luke explained what he had discovered: the dog facility, the corruption, and the way these animals were being exploited. He didn't sugarcoat it. Mike listened carefully, his silence only interrupted by the occasional muttered cuss. When Luke finished, Mike didn't hesitate. "Get the evidence, Luke. We'll make them pay. I know people veterans, animal rights groups. We'll make sure they can't hide this." Mike was in. Just like that, and just as quickly, Luke reached out to others veterans who had worked with military dogs, people who had seen the darker side of the system. Each call was met with outrage, each person pledging their help. The more people Luke spoke to, the more he realized that this wasn't just his fight anymore, it was theirs to dot by the time the sun had set. Luke had gathered a team of veterans and activists ready to help him expose the truth. They set a plan into motion, starting with documenting the conditions of the facility. Luke had hidden a camera in his van when he left, and although it hadn't captured much, it was enough to begin building a case. The team would go through the proper channels, but they would also go beyond them if necessary. The evidence needed to get out no matter the cost. The next day, Luke and his team returned to the facility, this time more prepared. They had a strategy in place, with multiple cameras, recording devices, and even a few covert sources within the facility who were willing to help. As Luke parked his van outside the gates again, his heart pounded in his chest. The weight of the mission was heavy on his shoulders, but the thought of Bolt, of all the animals who had been neglected, kept him moving forward. His team split into groups, each with their own task. Luke and Mike headed toward the main building, where they'd already planned to slip inside and gather footage of the conditions. The rest of the team had already spoken with a local journalist who had agreed to run the story once they had the evidence. The pieces were falling into place. But Luke knew they were on borrowed time. The people behind the facility were powerful, and they wouldn't take kindly to being exposed. As Luke stepped through the facility's back door, the familiar stench of the place hit him like a slap in the face. The air felt thick with tension, like the building itself knew something was about to change. He swallowed hard and followed Mike through the maze of dark corridors. They didn't speak much, but the shared sense of purpose between them was enough to keep them moving forward. They reached the back of the building where the dogs were kept, and what they saw was worse than Luke had imagined. The dogs were in even worse condition than he had thought. Some had open wounds. Others were missing patches of fur, and most of them looked completely defeated. It was a grim sight, and for a moment, Luke wanted to turn and leave. But then he looked at Bolt's face in his mind, and he knew he couldn't walk away. Not now. Not when so many others were depending on him to get the truth out. They set up the hidden cameras, capturing footage of the facility's conditions. As they worked, Luke's mind kept returning to the same thought. This wasn't just a bad facility. This was a system that had been allowed to thrive for too long. If they didn't act, nothing would ever change. With the cameras hidden and the footage rolling, Luke took a deep breath. The hardest part was over. Now, all they had to do was make sure the truth reached the right people. The days following their covert operation were a whirlwind of activity, and the tension never seemed to ease. Luke's team worked tirelessly to get their evidence organized. Every piece of footage from the hidden cameras, every document they could obtain from inside the facility, was analyzed and shared with the right people: veterans, animal rights activists, investigative journalists. Luke knew the stakes were high. The people behind this operation were powerful, and exposing them would not be easy. But for the first time in a long while, He felt a flicker of hope. The footage, however grim, was undeniable. The dogs, caged and neglected, were evidence enough. But Luke and Mike both knew they needed more, something that would tie the corruption back to the individuals responsible. Something that would make it impossible for anyone to deny the truth. They were working against a clock. The facility's administrators, those who ran the network that exploited these animals, wouldn't wait around to be exposed. Luke felt like he was in a race against time. Late one evening, while they were reviewing the footage in the dim light of Luke's living room, the phone rang. It was Mike. "I got something," Mike said, his voice low and urgent. "A contact inside the company. One of the contractors, they want to talk. They've been watching the news and they're scared. This could be our chance to get more evidence straight from the inside." Luke's heart raced. This was the break they needed. The contact, a man named Greg, had worked with the facility's management in the past but had recently become disillusioned with what he had witnessed. Now, he was willing to help expose the people behind it all. "I'll meet him," Luke replied, already grabbing his coat and keys. He trusted Mike's instincts, and if Mike said this was their shot, then it was. Greg, when Luke met him, was a man in his late 30s, a former military contractor with a hardened demeanor. He was clearly nervous, glancing over his shoulder as they spoke in a quiet, out-of-the-way diner. The shadow of fear hung over him. He knew the risks of crossing the powerful people involved in the operation. "They don't care about these dogs," Greg said quietly, his voice tinged with guilt. "They use them, break them down, and then sell them to anyone with enough cash. It's a dirty business, but it's big money. The military gets a cut of the profits too. Only they don't know the full story." Luke leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "Who's behind it? Who's making the money?" Greg hesitated, his eyes flicking nervously to the door. "The contractor's name is Chandler and Sons. They have ties to the military and private security firms. People at the top who are all too willing to look the other way. The dogs are just another commodity to them." Luke's stomach twisted. Chandler and Sons was one of the largest defense contractors in the country. They had government contracts, private security work, and countless deals with military agencies. They were untouchable, also it seemed. But now, Luke had a name, a target to focus on. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to fall into place. Greg continued, "I've seen the paperwork, how they route the contracts, how they shuffle the dogs between different facilities to keep everything off the radar. But there's one guy, Mr. Chandler himself, who's the real problem. If you want to bring this down, you have to go after him. He's the one running everything from behind the scenes." Luke clenched his fists. The fight had just gotten bigger, but he wasn't backing down. Chandler wasn't just a businessman. He was a key player in the whole system of corruption. Taking him down could unravel the entire operation, but doing so wouldn't be easy. Chandler had connections that reached deep into the heart of the military-industrial complex. He was a man who could make people disappear without a trace if it suited him. "I'm going after him," Luke said, his voice steady. "But I need your help. We need to get the proof, and we need to expose this to the public. Now that we know who's behind it, we're not backing off." Greg seemed to consider the risks for a moment, then nodded. "I'll help, but I can't be involved directly. I'll give you what I can, but you'll have to be careful. If Chandler finds out I'm talking, he'll ruin my life." With that, Greg slipped Luke a folded documents, photos and names that connected Chandler and Sons to the network of private contractors running the dog farming operation. It wasn't much, but it was enough to build the case. This was Luke's chance to make it public, to finally expose the corruption that had caused so much suffering for the war dogs, including Bold Dot. As the meeting ended and Luke returned to his van, He felt a sense of urgency wash over him. They were closer now than ever before, but so were the risks. Chandler and Sons would fight back, and they wouldn't play fair. Luke knew that going up against someone like Chandler wasn't just a fight for the truth, it was a fight for survival. The people in power didn't like being exposed, and they wouldn't hesitate to silence anyone who threatened their business. But Luke wasn't afraid. He had a team. He had the truth, and he had Bolt. That was all he needed. This character deserves the like, but unfortunately, they haven't received it yet. The weight of everything Luke had uncovered was almost too much to bear, but it was also what propelled him forward. The pieces were finally fitting together: the corrupt contractors, the military's indirect involvement, and the horrifying treatment of the retired war dogs. As Luke and his team prepared for the final push, the atmosphere was tense. They had a solid case, but now they needed to expose the truth to the world before Chandler and Sons could sweep it all under the rug. The plan was simple in theory, but dangerous in practice. The first step was to get Chandler's involvement into the open. They had documents, Greg's insider info, photographs, and confidential contracts that linked Chandler to the abuse. With the help of Mike and a few trusted veterans, Luke had arranged a meeting with a journalist named Jessica Harrow. She was an investigative reporter with a reputation for exposing corruption in both government and private sectors. Luke had crossed paths with her in the past, and he knew she had the courage and the platform to bring this story to light. The plan was to meet Jessica at a location that was far removed from prying eyes, a local bar. An old haunt from Luke's past would be the perfect setting to ensure they weren't overheard. The tension was palpable as the team gathered in the back room. Preparing the evidence, they'd amassed footage from the facility, the damning paperwork, and Greg's testimony. As Luke waited for Jessica to arrive, he couldn't help but think of Bolt. The dog had been his anchor throughout this journey, and Luke owed him everything. Without Bolt, he never would have discovered the full extent of the abuse. But now, as they prepared to expose the truth, there was no turning back. If they succeeded, they could put an end to the cruelty that had plagued so many animals. But if they failed, there would be consequences far more dangerous than any battle Luke had ever faced. The door to the bar creaked open, and Jessica stepped inside, her sharp eyes scanning the room before settling on Luke. She was a woman in her late 30s, wearing a leather jacket and looking every bit as determined as Luke felt. He could see the seriousness in her eyes as she approached. "Everything ready?" Jessica asked, taking a seat at the table. Luke nodded, pushing the pile of evidence toward her. "This is it. We've got everything. Chandler and Sons is at the heart of it all. These dogs, they were treated like nothing more than tools, and it's been going on for years. If we expose this, it'll bring down the entire operation. But we need to move fast." Jessica looked through the documents, her brow furrowing as she read. "This is huge, Luke. If this gets out, it'll send shockwaves through the military-industrial complex. Chandler is a big name, the kind of person who doesn't just walk away from something like this without a fight." Luke didn't flinch. He was used to battles. "Then we make sure he's the one who loses this fight." Just as Jessica prepared to ask a follow-up question, the sound of footsteps echoed from the entrance, and Mike stepped into the bar, his face grim. "We've got a problem," he said, his voice low. Luke's heart sank. "What's going on?" "They know," Mike said. "Chandler's people. They've been watching us. Someone tipped them off. The meeting we set up, it's compromised." Panic hit Luke like a tidal wave, but he quickly steadied himself. This was the moment. The moment they either backed down or pushed forward. "Are we exposed?" Luke asked, his eyes narrowing. Mike shook his head. "Not yet. But we need to get the evidence out to the right people fast. We're running out of time." Jessica looked at both men. her determination unwavering. "Then we act now. If Chandler's people are on their way, we don't have the luxury of waiting. I'll get the story out. You just need to make sure it sticks. We'll hit them where it hurts. Public exposure, Liv." Luke's mind raced, but his resolve only solidified. They had what they needed: evidence, witnesses, and the truth. The only thing left to do was to make sure the world saw it. He looked at Mike, then at Jessica. There was no turning back. This was it, the fight for the truth and for the dogs who had been silenced for too long. They quickly gathered everything together, splitting up to take different routes in case Chandler's people were watching. Jessica went straight to the newsroom, ready to file the story. Mike and Luke would stay behind, monitoring the situation, ready for whatever came next. As Luke stepped into the alleyway behind the bar, he felt a deep sense of finality. The truth was about to break, and with it, the entire system of corruption. But in that moment, Luke realized something he hadn't before. This wasn't just about revenge or exposing wrongdoers. It was about giving these animals, and everyone who fought for them, a voice. It was about ensuring that no man, woman, or animal was ever forgotten again. As he waited in the shadows, ready for what was to come, Luke couldn't help but feel a sense of calm. He had no idea how this would all unfold, but he knew one thing: he had done the right thing. Whatever happened next, he had fought for the voiceless, and that, in the end, was all that mattered. Then, without warning, his phone buzzed with an alert. Jessica's article had gone live. Luke's heart raced as he read the headline on the screen: "Corruption Exposed. The Dark Truth Behind Military Dog Abuse and Chandler and Sons Profits." The fight had begun in earnest. The world changed in an instant. The headline on Luke's phone had barely registered before the notifications began flooding in. The article had gone live, and with it, the full scope of the scandal was now out in the open. The shocking details, the gruesome conditions, the names of the corrupt contractors, everything was exposed. Chandler and Sons could no longer hide behind their carefully crafted veneer. The world knew what they had done, and Luke, with his team, had ensured that the truth was undeniable. As the article spread across social media, news outlets began picking up the story. The public outrage was immediate. Comments poured in from animal rights activists, veterans, and concerned citizens demanding accountability. The dogs, the heroes who had been forgotten, were no longer invisible. Their suffering was being acknowledged, and the people responsible were now in the crosshairs. But even as the world reacted, Luke's heart raced with dread. This was just the beginning. Chandler and Sons wouldn't go down without a fight, and Luke knew that they had already taken notice of him. He had to be ready. The last thing he needed was for this story to be buried or for the whistleblowers to be silenced. Mike, who had been monitoring the situation from a nearby location, called Luke just as he was about to leave the bar. "Luke, it's bad." Mike's voice was urgent. "Chandler's people are mobilizing. They're pushing back hard. This isn't over. They're trying to discredit the story." Luke's stomach clenched. The people behind Chandler and Sons were powerful, and they had resources that most didn't. They had the means to manipulate the narrative, to bury the truth. But Luke wasn't going to let that happen. Not now. Not after everything they had fought for. "I'm not going anywhere," Luke said, his voice steady despite the storm of emotion swirling inside him. "This fight isn't over yet." Mike's voice crackled through the phone. "We need to get the word out to the right people. The newsrooms, the animal rights groups, the lawmakers, anyone who can keep this from being swept under the rug. We've got to apply pressure." "I'm on it," Luke replied, hanging up the phone and stepping into the night. He could hear the distant sound of sirens, but it wasn't enough to stop him. He had made a promise to the dogs who had suffered, to the veterans who had trusted him, and to Bolt. He wasn't going to stop until Chandler and Sons was held accountable. The next few hours were a blur of action. Luke and his team worked frantically to keep the momentum going. They reached out to every media outlet they could, making sure the story didn't fade from the headlines. They provided more evidence documents, photos, and witness accounts to ensure that the truth couldn't be denied. Meanwhile, Chandler and Sons fought back. They hired public relations firms, launched smear campaigns, and tried to discredit the whistleblowers. They did everything they could to protect their empire, to preserve their profits. But the pressure was mounting. Every hour, more people learned the truth, more calls were made, and more emails flooded in demanding action. The situation escalated quickly. Luke's phone buzzed incessantly with updates. The media storm had reached a fever pitch, and with it, the public's fury. The story was no longer just about a few dogs, it was about a system of abuse, of corruption, and of exploitation that had gone unchecked for far too long. And now, the world was watching. By the time dawn broke, things had already started to shift. The government had launched an investigation into Chandler and Sons, and lawmakers were calling for hearings. The military, caught in the crossfire, was being forced to reckon with its role in the abuse of retired war dogs. The weight of the story was impossible to ignore, and the pressure was too great for even the most powerful figures to sweep it aside. But even as the winds of change began to blow, Luke knew the hardest part was yet to come. This wasn't just about bringing down Chandler and Sons, it was about ensuring that the system was rebuilt, that the future of retired military dogs was secure. They had to make sure that no more dogs would be left behind, that no more heroes would be discarded like trash. Luke sat in his van, watching the city wake up around him, the weight of everything pressing down on him. His phone buzzed again. It was a text from Mike. "They're coming for us. Be careful." Luke didn't respond immediately. Instead, he took a deep breath. His thoughts focused on Bolt. He could still feel the dog's trust in him, even now, even after everything they had been through. He knew that this fight, this battle for justice, was about more than just exposing corruption. It was about giving those who had been silenced the voice they deserved. The next few weeks were a blur. The investigation into Chandler and Sons continued, and the pressure from the public and the media only grew. Luke, Mike, and their team kept pushing, ensuring that the story stayed at the forefront of the conversation. They knew that the people responsible for the abuse would fight back with everything they had. But Luke was no longer afraid. They had the truth on their side, and the truth would be unstoppable. As the investigation unfolded, more whistleblowers came forward. The full extent of Chandler and Sons' operations, how they had exploited war dogs for profit, how they had manipulated the system, came to light. It was a scandal that would rock the nation, and it became a symbol of how even the most powerful systems could be toppled by the courage of a few individuals. Luke, standing at the center of it all, finally felt a sense of peace. It was the beginning of justice, not just for Bolt, but for all the dogs who had served with honor and loyalty. They had been forgotten, but they would never be forgotten again. The story of their suffering had reached the world, and in that, Luke found a sense of purpose that he had been searching for since his discharge from the military. The fight wasn't over yet, but for the first time in years, Luke believed that the battle for the voiceless Kudand would be won. Despite the overwhelming surge of public support and the mounting pressure on Chandler and Sons, the battle was far from over. Luke and his team had managed to expose the truth, and the investigation into the corporation was gaining traction. But with every victory, there came another obstacle. Late one evening, after another long day of organizing press conferences and working with the investigative teams, Luke received a call that would change everything. His phone rang, a number he didn't recognize flashing on the screen. He hesitated before answering, his mind already running through the worst-case scenarios. Luke. The voice on the other end was Mike's, but it sounded strained, tight with an urgency Luke had never heard before. "What's going on?" Luke asked, his gut tightening as he braced himself for bad news. "They found out. They've started targeting our people," Mike said, his voice barely a whisper, as if the very mention of it might make it worse. "Sarah, one of the inside contacts who helped us, she's gone." The world seemed to slow round Luke. His thoughts immediately went to Sarah, the woman who had helped them uncover so much of the corruption within the system. She had been instrumental in exposing the true scale of the abuse and had been ready to testify. Now, her absence hit Luke like a physical blow. "Gone." "What do you mean gone?" Luke demanded, his mind racing. "I don't know the details, but the authorities were called in. It's like she vanished. No one has seen her, and there's no trace. It's not like her to disappear, Luke. She was a whistleblower, and now she's missing." The words sent a chill through Luke's body. He could hear the faint sound of sirens in the background as Mike continued. "I'm telling you, they're coming for us, one by one. This is bigger than just Chandler and Sons. They're not just going to let this go. Someone's making sure of that." Luke felt his blood run cold. He had known the fight would get dangerous. He had known that exposing the truth about powerful people came with risks. But to hear that one of their own was being silenced, vanished without a trace, was something else entirely. Luke clenched his fists, anger and fear mixing into a sharp, bitter rage. "I'm not letting this go, Mike. We've come too far," Luke said, his voice low and steady, though inside a storm was raging. "We need to be careful, Luke. This isn't a game anymore. They'll do whatever it takes to cover this up. I don't know how far they're willing to go." Luke's mind was racing, but all he could focus on was the fact that someone who had risked everything to help them was now gone. The sense of injustice was overwhelming, but he wasn't about to back down. He couldn't. Not now. Not after everything they had uncovered. "Find her, Mike," Luke said firmly. "We're going to keep pushing. No one else is going to disappear. And we're not going to stop until we get justice for Sarah and all the dogs." As he hung up, the weight of what had just happened pressed down on him, and his stomach churned with guilt and anger. He had known the stakes, but losing someone like Sarah, someone who had put everything on the line, made the fight feel more personal, more urgent. He knew that this would only fuel his determination to bring Chandler and Sons down, but the cost was becoming higher than he had ever anticipated. Luke was no longer just fighting for the dogs or the truth. He was fighting for the lives of those who had dared to help him, fighting for justice, no matter the cost. But deep down, he couldn't shake the feeling that they had crossed a line, and the road ahead would only get more dangerous. The news of Sarah's disappearance hit Luke harder than he expected. The uncertainty of her fate, the fact that she had vanished without a trace, gnawed at him. It was no longer just a fight for truth, it was personal now. The stakes had become infinitely higher. In the days that followed, Luke couldn't shake the image of Sarah, sitting across from him in that small, dimly lit cafe, her eyes full of determination and fear. She had risked everything, knowing the dangers, and now she was gone. He couldn't afford to let her sacrifice be in vain. But every step forward felt like a step deeper into a maze that had no clear exit. The pressure was mounting. The media had picked up the story, and the momentum behind the scandal was overwhelming. But Chandler and Sons weren't backing down. They had already started using their power to intimidate anyone involved. They began pulling strings in the background, leveraging connections to silence the most vocal critics and undermine the public outcry. Luke felt the weight of it all, the constant threat hanging over him. It wasn't just Chandler anymore, it was a network of powerful, dangerous people who would stop at nothing to protect their interests. They knew what was at stake. They would go to any lengths to cover it up, and Luke now realized just how far they were willing to go. One night, after a long day of strategizing and gathering what little information they could on Sarah's disappearance, Luke stood on the porch of his house, looking out at the darkened street. The quiet, peaceful neighborhood that had once felt like a refuge now felt like a trap. Every sound, every rustle of the wind, seemed to carry an ominous undertone. He had no illusions anymore about the dangers they were facing. His phone buzzed, breaking the silence. It was Mike again. Luke. Mike's voice crackled through the phone. "We've got more bad news." "What is it?" Luke asked, his heart sinking. He already knew, deep down, that whatever Mike was about to say would be another blow. "It's Greg," Mike replied, his voice tight with disbelief. "The contact we had inside the facility, the one who gave us all the documents. He's gone too. Disappeared just like Sarah. There's no sign of him. It's like they've wiped him off the face of the earth." Luke's blood ran cold. First Sarah, now Greg. To people who had risked everything to help them. To people who had put their lives on the line. The realization hit him hard. They weren't just dealing with a corrupt company, they were up against something far darker. Something far more dangerous. "I'm done hiding, Mike," Luke said, his voice grim. "I'm going after Chandler. I'm going to make sure this doesn't end with us. We can't let them silence us like this." Mike didn't respond immediately, but Luke could hear him breathing heavily on the other end. "Luke, be careful. This isn't just about us anymore. They'll stop at nothing to protect themselves." "I know," Luke replied, his jaw set. "But we're not stopping until we get justice for Sarah, for Greg, for every single dog that was forgotten." The fight had shifted in that moment. It wasn't just about exposing the truth anymore, it was about survival. Luke knew the risks, but he was no longer afraid. He was driven by the losses, by the people who had been taken from him, and by the responsibility he felt to make sure their sacrifices counted. The world outside his house was still, but inside, Luke felt the storm raging. He was done being a passive player in this game. It was time to take the fight to Chandler and Sons. No matter the cost, your support means the world to us. Please consider subscribing to our channel, as it helps us bring you more heartwarming and inspiring stories. By subscribing, you're not just supporting us, but you're also helping these incredible animals and veterans get the recognition they deserve. Thank you for your support. Luke's resolve was like steel. The disappearance of Sarah and Greg had struck him hard, but it only strengthened his determination. He knew now that this fight wasn't just about exposing a corrupt company, it was about ensuring that people like Sarah, Greg, and the countless innocent animals caught in this mess would not be forgotten. But Luke had underestimated how far Chandler and Sons were willing to go to keep their operations hidden. The more he pushed, the deeper the web of lies, deceit, and manipulation he found himself entangled in. He spent the next several days working in overdrive. He contacted everyone he could think of: veterans, animal rights activists, lawmakers, even journalists with large platforms. The more people he spoke to, the more he learned about just how deeply Chandler's corruption ran. Chandler and Sons was far more than just a defense contractor. It was a massive, multifaceted business with its fingers in everything from military contracts to private security firms, all designed to cover up the exploitation of military animals for a profit. And then, one night, Luke received a call from an unexpected source: Allison, a journalist with a reputable news outlet that had been following the story. She had just received a mysterious tip from an anonymous insider. The tip included shocking details about Chandler's operations, more than what Luke had uncovered so far. Allison had access to classified government documents detailing how Chandler and Sons had bribed officials within the military to ensure that retired war dogs were shipped to private facilities. Where then, why could be resold or neglected? The documents revealed that the corruption went far higher than just private contractors. They were linked to high-ranking military officials who had turned a blind eye to the abuse. Luke's heart pounded in his chest as Allison read through the documents to him. His mind raced as he realized the scale of the operation was much larger than he could have ever anticipated. The corruption wasn't just confined to Chandler and Sons, it was embedded in the very system that had been responsible for training and caring for these dogs. The military had been complicit in allowing these animals to be exploited for financial gain, and those who had raised concerns had been silenced. This is it, Luke said, almost to himself. This is the missing piece. This is how deep it goes. Allison hesitated. Luke, this is bigger than anything we've seen. If we expose this, we're not just taking down Chandler and Sons, we're going after the military itself. We're talking about the highest levels of corruption. You realize how dangerous this is, right? Luke stared out the window of his van, watching the street lights blur as he ran his hand through his hair. He had known the risks from the beginning, but hearing Allison confirm the breadth of the conspiracy made everything seem so much more real and so much more dangerous. The scale of what they were about to take on felt like an insurmountable mountain. I know, Luke said, his voice steady despite the storm of emotion swelling inside him. But this isn't just about Chandler and Sons anymore. This is about everything. If we don't expose this, then every single one of those dogs will have died for nothing. I won't let that happen. The weight of his words hung in the air, and Allison didn't speak for a moment. Luke could hear the distant sounds of traffic on the other end of the line, the quiet hum of the world going on as usual. But everything had changed now. The system was broken, and they had the evidence to prove it. All right, we're doing this, Allison said finally. I'll make sure this gets out there, but you need to prepare yourself. Luke, Chandler will come after us. If we expose this, they won't just try to cover it up, they'll make us targets. Luke nodded. He had already anticipated that they would be in danger, but hearing Allison confirm it made it all the more real. This wasn't just about exposing corruption. It was about surviving it. He hung up the phone, his thoughts racing. They had the documents, the proof, the witnesses, but this wasn't going to be enough. The corruption had grown roots too deep, and the powers that be wouldn't let it go down without a fight. Luke had underestimated the lengths Chandler and Sons and the military were willing to go to protect their secrets. Suddenly, everything came into sharp focus. The story wasn't about exposing a few corrupt individuals. It was about exposing a system of betrayal, where people in positions of power were profiting off the suffering of innocent animals and soldiers alike. But now, Luke realized the stakes had changed again. If Chandler and Sons wanted a fight, they had just gotten one. But it was no longer just about saving Bolt or even exposing the truth. It was about bringing down a corrupt system that would stop at nothing to protect itself. Luke's fight had just become more personal, more dangerous, and more crucial than ever. He had no illusions about the risks he was facing, but with each passing hour, his resolve grew stronger. The truth was out there now, and there was no turning back. The war to bring it to light had begun in earnest, and this time, Luke was going to finish it. The days that followed felt like an unrelenting storm. The story about Chandler and Sons and the corrupt system they had built to exploit military dogs had gone viral. Journalists from all over the world were reaching out for interviews, and protests were beginning to spring up in front of government buildings and military bases. The public outrage was immense. The truth was finally out in the open, and Luke could feel the weight of it pressing down on him. But with that exposure came retaliation. Chandler and Sons weren't the only ones with power. They had allies, and some of them wore military uniforms. In the wake of the revelations, Luke and his team were being targeted. Late-night phone calls from anonymous sources threatened their lives, and their personal information began to surface on websites linked to extremist groups. The intensity of the pressure was overwhelming, but Luke's resolve remained unshaken. Then, one evening, as Luke sat at a desk surrounded by documents, his phone buzzed with an alert. He'd received an encrypted email. It was from Greg, his former inside contact who had disappeared weeks ago. Luke's heart raced as he opened the message. The first line of the email was brief. "They know everything. It's worse than you think." Luke's hands trembled slightly as he continued reading, his breath quickening. Greg detailed how Chandler and Sons had gone to extreme lengths to keep their operation under wraps, including silencing key witnesses and tampering with evidence. It turned out that the documents they had obtained weren't just about corruption within the company, they were also about cover-ups within the highest echelons of the military. Some of the officials involved were actively sabotaging investigations into the abuse, directing resources to prevent anyone from truly exposing the truth. God damn it. Luke whispered under his breath as the reality hit him. This wasn't just about one company. This was a far-reaching conspiracy involving people who held the power to destroy anyone who threatened their interests. But then, Gregor did something even more disturbing. He wrote about a final solution Chandler had arranged, one that involved shifting blame to a series of fabricated stories about rogue elements within the company, hoping to cover up the larger scandal. It was clear now. The corruption was so deeply ingrained that even if Chandler and Sons fell, the people behind the curtain would remain untouched. In the midst of all this, Luke realized something that had eluded him for so long. The real enemy was never just Chandler and Sons. They were a part of a much larger system, a system that had been built to protect the guilty and silence the truth. The military-industrial complex wasn't just about profit. It was about controlling the narrative, suppressing those who had the courage to fight back, and making sure that the truth never reached the public. Luke knew that with every revelation, the stakes had risen. The enemies he was up against now weren't just corrupt businessmen, they were powerful institutions with a vested interest in keeping their secrets hidden. And Chandler and Sons were only one cog in a much larger machine. Determined not to let the momentum fade, Luke reached out to Allison, the investigative journalist who had helped him from the beginning. Her voice was tight with anxiety when she answered. "Luke, I've got a lead on Chandler's private dealings, something big. It's about a government contract that ties back to the military's role in the abuse. We can use it to blow this thing wide open." But just as hope flickered, Luke's phone buzzed again this time. It was a call from Mike. "Luke," Mike said urgently, "they've moved on us. We've got a leak. Someone from our team is talking to the other side. They've got inside info, and they're using it to turn the tide. Someone's playing both sides." Luke's stomach dropped. He knew the risks when they started, but this betrayal, this reversal shattered his sense of security. They had always been a small group of people fighting a giant, but now they were splintering. Someone in his circle had turned, had leaked their plans to the enemy. The realization hit hard. The system they were up against wasn't just a faceless corporate entity, it was a network of people willing to betray anything and anyone to protect their secrets. But Luke wasn't one to give up, not now. Not after everything that had happened. This wasn't just about taking down Chandler and Sons or uncovering the truth for the public. It was about survival, about staying one step ahead of the forces that wanted to bury the truth once and for all. "I'm not backing down," Luke said, his voice steely with resolve. "We've come this far. We're exposing everything. If they want to fight, they've got it." As he ended the call, Luke felt the weight of the situation press on him like never before. Betrayal, Corruption, how he wasn't just fighting to expose a single criminal act anymore. He was fighting to take down an entire system. And in that moment, Luke understood that the consequences of their actions would not be easy to bear. This battle was bigger than he had ever imagined, and the price of truth might be higher than he was ready to pay. But there was no turning back. He would continue, even if it meant facing an enemy far more dangerous than he had anticipated. They had the truth, and now they had to make sure the world saw it no matter the cost. The chaos of the past few weeks had taken its toll on Luke. The constant threats, the betrayals, and the ever-looming danger of being exposed had pushed him to his breaking point. But through it all, he never once wavered. The fight had changed him, transformed him from a man hunted by his past to one driven by a singular purpose: to bring justice, not just for Bolt, but for every single animal and person who had been silenced by corruption and greed. The last few days had felt like an exhausting blur of phone calls, meetings, and strategy sessions. The weight of what they were up against hung heavy over him. But the momentum they had built was undeniable. The evidence was irrefutable. Chandler and Sons were going down, and the system that had allowed them to thrive was about to be exposed in a way that no one could ignore. The tipping point had come when they managed to leak the final piece of evidence: a government contract that linked Chandler and Sons directly to high-ranking military officials. This contract, hidden in plain sight, had been the key that allowed them to continue their operations with impunity. Once it was out in the open, there was no hiding. The public outcry was deafening, and the pressure was too great for even the most powerful to ignore. Luke's role in all of this had been clear. He wasn't just the whistleblower, he was the symbol of the fight for justice. The media had latched onto his story, his determination, his refusal to back down, and his relentless pursuit of the truth had captured the hearts of millions. The public rallied behind him, flooding social media with support for the animals and veterans alike. But even as the tide turned, Luke knew there was more to be done. The first wave of justice was about to be served. But he couldn't rest yet. There were still unanswered questions, still corruption to expose, and still lives to protect. Chandler and Sons had lost their grip, but Luke couldn't allow the systems that enabled them to survive to stay in place. The day the news broke, when the investigations reached their crescendo, Luke sat in his small, modest house with Bolt by his side. The dog had made a remarkable recovery. His coat had begun to regrow, his energy slowly returning. They were healing together, in a way that neither of them had expected. But as much as Luke had hoped for a quiet, peaceful life, he knew that wasn't going to happen. Not after everything that had come to light. For the first time in years, he felt the weight of his service both in the military and in this fight starting to lift. The battle was far from over, but the first steps had been taken. The military and government officials who had protected Chandler and Sons were now scrambling to cover their tracks, but they couldn't stop what had already been set in motion. Luke looked down at Bolt, who lay quietly at his feet, his head resting on Luke's leg. The dog had been his companion through some of the darkest times in his life, and now, through the darkest times of his fight for justice, Bolt's loyalty, his unwavering trust, had given Luke the strength to keep moving forward. "I couldn't have done it without you, buddy," Luke whispered, his voice thick with emotion, and it was true. Without Bolt, without the spark of injustice he had felt when he saw his dog abandoned, Luke might never have taken that first step. Without that bond, that unbreakable connection between them, Luke wouldn't have found the courage to face down an entire system of corruption. He owed everything to that dog, and the dogs like him, forgotten heroes whose stories had been hidden for too long. But now, the world knew the truth. The fight wasn't over, and there would be more battles to come. But this victory, this moment, was a testament to everything Luke had fought for. He had helped bring down one of the most powerful organizations in the country, and in doing so, he had given a voice to the voiceless. For the first time in years, Luke felt a sense of peace. It wasn't complete, and the road ahead was still uncertain. But it was a start, a new beginning. The darkness was receding, and with it came a glimmer of hope for Bolt, for the other animals, and for Luke himself. He smiled softly as Bolt lifted his head, meeting his gaze with those familiar, trusting eyes. It wasn't just about the fight anymore. It was about healing. Healing from the war. Healing from the years of neglect. And together, they were finally finding peace. The battle for justice would continue. But for now, Luke knew they had won the first round. And with that victory, there was hope that maybe, just maybe, the world could change for the better. In the weeks that followed, the world began to shift in response to the revelations surrounding Chandler and Sons. The public outcry continued to grow, and pressure mounted on every level of government. The scandal had become too big to ignore, and people from all walks of life, veterans, animal rights activists, concerned citizens came together to demand accountability. It was clear that the system was broken, but the fight for justice had sparked something larger, a movement. Luke, however, wasn't basking in the victory. He couldn't. The fight had come at a high cost. Every victory was tinged with the loss of those who had helped him along the way: Sarah, Greg, and so many others who had been silenced. Their sacrifices had been enormous. But Luke knew they hadn't given up just for a fleeting moment of justice. They had given up to change the system, to give a voice to the forgotten. He spent the next several months tirelessly working with organizations, building partnerships with animal rights groups and veterans advocacy organizations. The momentum was palpable, and Luke had learned that his role now extended beyond simply seeking justice for Bolt. The fight had become larger than himself. It was about ensuring that no more dogs like Bolt would ever be abandoned, that no more people like Sarah or Greg would be silenced for daring to expose the truth. But even as the public rallied, and the first waves of reform began, Luke still carried the weight of the sacrifices. The truth was out, but the full extent of the corruption remained to be dealt with. High-ranking military officials were implicated, and the entire structure of how military working dogs were treated needed to be overhauled. The work ahead was monumental, but Luke had never been more determined. He wouldn't rest until those responsible for the horrors had been held accountable. As he sat in his modest home one evening, Bolt curled up beside him, Luke reflected on everything that had happened. The dog had come so far since being rescued from that cold, heartless facility. His coat had grown back, and his energy had returned. The once traumatized animal now exuded a calm strength. He was a living testament to the power of second chances. Luke ran his hand through Bolt's fur and whispered, "We did it, buddy." There was a deep sense of gratitude in his words, gratitude for the strength that Bolt had given him, for the loyalty that had driven him forward even when the odds seemed insurmountable. But it wasn't just Bolt who had made the difference. It was the people who had stood by Luke, his team of veterans, the whistleblowers, the activists, and the people who had risked everything to bring the truth to light. Together, they had created a ripple effect that had changed the course of history. Chandler and Sons were facing the consequences of their actions, but the bigger victory was the newfound awareness about the treatment of retired military dogs, and the steps being taken to ensure that such abuses would never happen again. The government had pledged reforms, new policies were being discussed, and laws were being drafted to ensure that military working dogs received the care and dignity they deserved when their service ended. No longer would they be left to rot in forgotten corners of private facilities. There were now mechanisms in place to ensure their safety and well-being, and Luke was determined to continue working to make those laws as effective as possible. Still, Luke knew that no victory would be complete without the people who had been lost along the way. The faces of those who had helped him and who had paid the ultimate price remained with him. Sarah, Greg, and so many others were the unsung heroes of this story. They had stood by him when the world seemed blind to the truth. They had sacrificed everything for the greater good. For Luke, the message was clear. The battle for justice wasn't just about taking down one company or exposing a few bad actors. It was about ensuring that people and animals who could not speak for themselves were heard. It was about holding the powerful accountable, no matter how deep their pockets or how far their reach. And perhaps most importantly, it was about hope. The fight was far from over, but the victory had sparked something in the hearts of millions. People had come together, united by the power of a single story, a story about loyalty, justice, and if you want to support our team, don't forget to hit the subscribe button, share this video with your friends and family, and leave a comment below sharing your thoughts. Would you like to hear part 2? Let us know in the comments. Your support helps us bring you more heartfelt stories like this one.